Hello again, back with I guess some more theory, because so many questions have been coming in across Instagram, on Facebook, DMs, email, and comments on these videos with more questions. So clearly my theory episode wasn't quite thorough enough. Sorry about that. There is a lot that goes into doing smelts, and I'm not sure how much of the actual science was understood in the ancient world. I think it was a lot of trial and error, which is why there's so much mystique about it. But I wanted to do a Q&A episode that answers some of the quite good questions that have come of this. So let's just get right to it. So I mentioned in the theory video that if you don't tap your slag, you will get iron prills instead of a bloom. But there are other reasons that can happen. One is that you haven't maintained a consistent enough heat and at the right temperature. You really need your that reduction zone to be like 1200 to 1400 degrees Celsius, and it can fluctuate around there, which it's going to with bellows, but more or less you want to keep it at that good temperature, which is why charcoal is better than coke in that regard, because coke's heat is dependent on airflow a lot more heavily than charcoal. Charcoal is sort of like a flywheel. You can heat it up and then leave it for a bit, and then heat it up and then leave it for a bit, and its cool down is much slower. So holding it at that temperature for the entirety of the smelt is super key, and if you haven't done that properly, then or you've dipped too low, then that'll do it. Another one is that you're actually pumping too much air in too fast, and that actually makes your slag splash around, which can lead to nasty things. Less likely to form prills that way, but it can. Another one is that your charcoal quality is super low. If your charcoal quality is really bad, then you're going to not have effective reduction happen of the iron, and when the iron doesn't reduce properly, it can't coalesce properly, and if it can't coalesce properly, it can't sinter properly. So that's another big one to watch out for. So good quality charcoal matters, and ancient smiths would have known which trees to get it from, how long to age the trees for before charring them, what their process was for charring them, etc., etc. And also it does come down to charcoal preparation, which we will be going into in the next episode, hopefully, because the charcoal preparation is just as important as the ore preparation. So most of the time though, if you're getting prills instead of a bloom, it's because the blower setup that you're using mixed with the quality of the charcoal is just not hitting the temperatures that you need and not producing enough carbon dioxide to create that even reduction. The next question is, why is it bad if my slag is too thin? And so if the slag's too thin and runny and watery when it comes out, it probably means too much flux, or possibly too high a temperature. So it's finding a balance of those two things which will lead to good slag formation. So if it's too runny, it means it's too, the thinness of it means it will be carrying away iron from your the sintering conglomeration of iron that's in there, and if it's pulling away iron, you're losing iron. You'll be able to tell when you tap the slag, it will sparkle a little bit like a party sparkler, and that's a really good sign that it's bad. Also, if it splashes because it's watery, we talked about the sort of warm honey consistency. Warm honey doesn't splash, water does splash. So if your slag is too thin, you're either running your bloomery too hot, or you're overfluxing, which can be done intentionally. If your ore source has way too much gangue in it, or it's very limestone heavy, it can be putting in too much flux. And sometimes ore is just bad. Bad ore doesn't necessarily just come down, like whether ore is good or bad doesn't come down to just the iron oxide content. It also comes down to the gangue content, and I'll go into that in a little bit. The other question that came through is, why is it bad if the slag is too thick? So if the slag's too thick, it's sort of the opposite of if it's too thin. If it's too thick, or if there's chunks in it, then your temperature's either too low and your gangue isn't liquefying enough, which if it's not liquefying enough, it's not able to pull itself out of the conglomerating mass of iron. And if it's not pulling itself out, it's not pulling the impurities with it. So you want it to be, you want to up that temperature a bit. The other thing is, it just means there's not enough flux in there, so you need to add flux in there. So traditionally that could have been crushed up shells, it could be limestone, it could be even sand, good quality clean sand. So yeah, more flux is needed potentially if your temperature's good. If you suspect your temperature's good, it just means that the gangue component of your ore didn't have enough natural flux in it, so you've got to add flux in. Borax is great. Normally, modern smiths use borax a lot as flux, and it works great. In medieval context, it's probably going to be crushed up oyster shells or limestone. This question is really good. I like this one. It shows that you're thinking differently. So you're right. A lot of the individual things like silica and things in the gangue have a higher melting temperature than iron. So how do they get liquefied when the iron doesn't? That's a really interesting question. The answer is just as interesting. The gangue is made up of lots of different elements, but it's not, those elements aren't liquefying. So Alex Steele ran into a similar process when he was trying to forge weld titanium and carbon steel, and he found that it just wouldn't weld, and he's like, I don't understand, all that's in there is titanium and carbon steel, there's nothing else. But there was something else, because in that hot of an environment you don't really have just titanium and steel or just silica and limestone and iron. They fuse together and form eutectic alloys. Those alloys have a lower melting temperature than their parent components. It's pretty cool chemistry when you think about it. So take silica, for example. The silica in most ironstone is going to be probably quartz or something quartzite. Quartz has a much higher melting temperature to iron. However, if you flux quartz with the presence of limestone, for example, it forms sort of silicate-like eutectic alloys, and those alloys melt much lower at much lower temperatures to the iron. And so this is how it works. Like, ancient smiths just wouldn't have had any clue exactly what the chemistry was going on, most likely, but they would learn that some sources of ore would yield better results, so they would abandon the bad ones and just take from the good ones, places like bogs that had bog iron or locations for found ironstone, because they would know this ore works, this ore doesn't. And there is a certain amount of luck. These days we can actually monitor what's going on and understand the process and add fluxing agents in there to lower the melting temperature of the gangue. But back then they might have figured it out with like adding oyster shells and things like that, but it would have been a process of trial and error, not understanding exactly what it was. So that's why there's a certain amount of mystique, certain amount of magic to it. But yeah, it's not silica that we're melting, it's not limestone that we're melting, it's the eutectic alloying of those two things in a hot, jazzy sort of environment where there's a lot of energy and a lot going on. So it's cool chemistry. And that was exactly the same problem that Alex Steele ran into. It wasn't just titanium and steel in there, because where the titanium touched the steel, it immediately started alloying and creating things that just don't like to forge weld. It's a new thing that's in there. So he didn't have two different elements in there, he had three. And the third one was causing the problems. In our case, the third one is the good one. It's what we want. So that's how it works. Iron itself is quite reactive, but since it's being held in a reducing environment, iron likes to agglomerate and not alloy with any of the other things that are present in the gangue. So this is a cool question, and the answer is probably going to disappoint you. It highlights how a lot of this is sort of trial and error. We do understand the science, and if you were doing this in a lab environment with proper furnaces and things like that, you would be able to control it. But if you're doing it like we are, with a clay tube, there's only so much sort of trial and error you can do to work this out. But as a good rule of thumb, yes, when you do your ore testing, this is why the roasting and testing process is so important. You take a piece of or even a couple of pieces from different parts of the ironstone, after you've roasted it, and you crush it and you test it, gauge how much magnetic material is in there, do your vinegar test to see if there's limestone present. The more fizzy it is, the more limestone there is, and it's sort of guesswork from there. But yes, the higher the magnetic compounds in there, the percentage, the thicker your layer can be as you add your charges, with a maximum theoretical layer height in this size foundry of 4 inches. I wouldn't go any thicker than that. Rushing is, and trying to feed too much ore in is going to choke this thing up. And every different foundry has a limit of how much you can add per charge. And this is why reading the slag and listening to the fire are so important. They will tell you what's going on, but it is a matter of feel. And this is why this sort of ancient wisdom was sort of passed down and secretive, because there's a lot of feel involved with this. Like a lot of just sort of gut feeling, you know. It reminds me of my motto, always trust your gut, but never trust a fart. This question's also a good one. Why doesn't the bloom, when it's small, fall inside the donut and cause all sorts of problems? The answer is actually pretty simple, and you may have seen Cody's Labs video where he floats an anvil on a pool of mercury, and it's because liquid metal is much denser than like water or something like that. Your bloom and the iron particles in your bloom float on the slag. They're held up, which is why we create the donut, because as they're floating around and the airflow is making our slag slosh a little bit, it's going to float around until it hits something. It's going to hit either the wall of the furnace, which is constantly sort of having slag slash against it, so sometimes it happens that way, sometimes not. But if we're lucky, because the airflow is going to be going like this, it's going to stick to the top of that dome, and especially while it's light. And once it sticks there, it's just going to stay there and stop floating, and just all the subsequent iron that floats on the slag is going to join and stick to that bloom, and that's how it forms. This question actually touches on a, a bit of a controversy. I did a short, one of my YouTube shorts a while back, that kind of went like mini viral, and it led to me getting so much hate, but it was because, like, I was right. It's one of those things. Anyway, the color that comes out of iron when it is hot can be used to determine the temperature that the iron is. However, what that color will look like to the human eye will change depending on the amount of ambient light. So if I take a piece of steel up to forge welding heat, forge weld, like literally about to do a forge weld, which normally looks like a super bright yellow, almost white in most circumstances. If I did that out in the open under full sun, like I was doing a show at a county fair or something like that, into the human eye under full sun, that iron would look dull red at best. But at the same time, if in my normal forging operations I was to bring something up to a dull red, which I know from experience is about 900 degrees Celsius, if I were to be doing that same forging in the dead of night with no lights on in my workshop where it's just pitch black, that dull red is now going to look like a bright orange, because our eye can only absorb, it absorbs the total of the light coming in, not just the light from one source. So what color the iron looks like can't be used as a reliable indicator to what temperature it is based on just your eye, unless you keep doing it in the same environment. So you will get to know what iron looks like at different colors in your particular forge, but you can't then take that knowledge, go to somebody else's forge and say, "I'll bring it up to a red heat," because a red heat in their forge, which might be out in the middle of a paddock under full sun, would look like a black heat, and vice versa. So if they only ever forge at night and they come to your forge, they're going to push steel much hotter than it needs, much lower than it needs to go. And if you are in a much brighter forge and you go somewhere where it's darker, you're going to not push it enough, and vice versa. So it's tricky to say a definitive answer to this, but it's kind of a moot point, Because if you just build a big bonfire and you fuel it well without adding extra air, like you've got no blowers on it, no leaf blower hitting it or anything, you're just letting it burn, and you've gotten this fire burning really, really well. A big old bonfire in its core is going to sit around the 800 to 1000 degrees, usually somewhere around 900 as a good ballpark figure. So you can kind of just assume that if you're not forcing air into it, or it's not a windy day that's blowing extra air into it and feeding it, and it's just burning in still air, and it's a big enough fire, you can be pretty guaranteed that your ore will be roasting at around 900 degrees Celsius. Around. Which, in like an objective sense, is a bright red heat. Maybe like a dull orange, somewhere around the transition from red to orange, about there. And so that's why I pointed out in that video, don't force air into it unless you're just getting it started. Once it is up to temperature and burning well on its own, a bonfire will look after itself if you just keep feeding in more fuel. That cycle will just continue and continue. So it's a controversial topic, but me saying that in that YouTube short just led to so much hate thrown at me, because people are like, you don't know what you're talking about. Even though in the video I took steel out of my forge when it was a bright orange, and I kept the camera on it, and I moved it from inside my dark forge out into the sunlight, and it went from orange to black. And then I took it back into the shadows of the forge, and it went back to orange. I showed it working. I showed this exact thing happening in real time, and people still didn't believe me. But this is how it works. You can try it yourself. Next time you're at your forge, bring it up to a bright orange heat, and then take it out into the sun. Or if you work under electric lights, bring it up to a dull red heat, and then turn off all the lights at nighttime and see what the color change is. You'd be surprised. This one came up, it wasn't presented as a question. They said, why don't I just bring a magnet instead of doing all of this hoity-toity science to try and find my ore? So magnetite, the iron oxide magnetite, is noticeably magnetic. And if you found rocks of just magnetite, sure, you'd stick a magnet on them and you're good. But most iron oxides are at best extremely weakly magnetic. So if you brought one of those giant fishing magnets, you might feel it a bit, but it's not going to be great, and it's going to be a lot of guesswork. Instead of just knowing, there are much more definitive ways to identify ironstone than just a magnet. It's the process of crushing and sorting and roasting our ore which will turn the other far less or even non-magnetic or almost non-magnetic iron oxides into magnetite. So it's actually a really good opportunity to learn. So I'm always open to that. So iron in oxide form does not guarantee magnetism. So magnetite is quite magnetic. That's why it's called magnetite. And old-fashioned, like in the old world, you sort of think of magnets as a modern invention. The ability to fabricate magnets is a modern invention, yeah, but magnets are found in nature all the time, and they're basically rocks of magnetite. And they used to call them lodestones, which is kind of cool. And they do occur naturally as basically blocks of magnetite, although that's quite rare. I mean, usually iron oxides that have formed naturally they come in the form of like hematite or siderite or other things like that, or pyrite, which really don't stick to a magnet well at the best of times. So let alone when they're surrounded by gangue in rocks that are sometimes this big. Especially, like, we've been really spoiled with my particular smelt because the ore quality is exceptional at 45 to 50%. So normally when you find an ironstone, you're looking at 10 to 30% ore in it if you're lucky. We've just been extremely lucky, so don't take my experience as necessarily a reflection of what you will find. So if you think of a rock the size of a basketball and only 10-15% of it is actually iron oxides at all, and then only like 5 or 10% of those oxides are already in the form of magnetite, which is quite geologically rare, it's not going to be that magnetic. You will notice it, you kind of will feel it if you've got a good one, but most of the time you won't have a good one. This is a super interesting one because of the metallurgy and history that comes with it. So for a bloomery smelt, you really don't want to put pre-made iron into the top of this, because putting pre-made iron into it kind of insinuates that you're reforming the iron. What we're doing is reducing the iron, which is a chemically very different process. So what would happen in medieval times is you would, and I'm going to kind of go into this, and I may even do it myself, like I may recreate it, and if there's enough call for it in the comments, I'll I will definitely give it a shot. In addition to a bloomery furnace, nearby you would have a shorter one that is usually only a couple of feet tall, called a hearth furnace. And a hearth furnace is designed to have very different environment to what happens in a bloomery furnace. And what you would do is you would make iron in the bloomery furnace by having a bloom at the end of it, and then the waste bits of bloom, or all of the bloom really if you wanted, would be broken up into small pieces and put in the hearth furnace in a separate, different process that would convert that iron into steel. It would carburize it. But hearth furnaces could also be used to take old iron, anything really, and steel, if the pieces are small enough. So like old nails or offcuts from other projects and things like that could go through there and make a steel sort of mini bloom at the end of it that, instead of being iron, is steel. So the hearth furnace is, it doesn't make the iron, but it turns the iron into steel. And how you run the hearth furnace will dictate the quality of that final steel. So it's a whole other thing that would probably be a multi-video topic as well, just like this one is. But yeah, if you can't find good iron ore in your area, keep looking. Is basically the answer. Don't try using old iron in a bloomery furnace. It won't go great for you. They call this one a stupid question. It's not a stupid question at all, actually. Why didn't I just make a bunch of bricks and stack them up and use the same mixture essentially as mortar? You can totally do that, but you can't have the skeleton inside if you do that. You don't need the skeleton inside. The skeleton inside is extra insurance, because while the clay can be pushed over, clay with a skeleton inside really can't fall over very easily. It takes a lot of work. Even after that chars on the inside during the firing process, it gives it incredible strength. And the reason we're doing it is because significant numbers of archaeological finds of bloomery smelters have that inside, because it serves two purposes. While it's air drying, as you've seen, that process is considerably long. You don't want something happening to it while it's air drying, and this internal skeleton really helps that. Secondly, when we do fire it in the coming days, it will char and burn away a lot of that scaffold that's inside there, leaving air channels through the clay, which will actually make the clay more refractive than it was if it were just solid. And so if you just have bricks, solid bricks, you can't really get that effect. But you absolutely can, and a lot of sort of medieval fire bricks were made this way and used this way. Especially if you make them big enough and you stack them right and you mortar them right, you really get your technique down. And especially if it's going to be a single-use furnace, you absolutely can. But one thing I will point out is that it's going to still be more or less the same amount of work, because the final volume of clay that you've worked is still going to be about 100 kilos of clay, which is a significant amount of clay to process, knead, fold, temper, and form. So the amount of work is going to be about the same. You're not saving any work by doing this, and it's just building it around a skeleton just gives you that added bit of extra insurance and extra refractory content. And that's it, really. That's all the questions I've gotten that haven't already been answered in previous videos. So yeah, as more come in, I'll try and drop little Q&A sections in future videos. But just if you have questions, drop them below. Don't worry, I know some people may think that they've got stupid questions. There's no stupid questions. This is something like the point of this series. The reason I'm doing this series is because there's so much either misinformation or lack of information about this process out there. huge amounts of process about the Tamahagane process or working with iron sand, but the good old-fashioned ironstone bloomery, it was the absolute backbone of iron production for most of that 3,000-year block. And there's just really not much information out there for it, especially on this thorough level. So if there's any aspect of it that you have a question about, drop it below. Feel free to. There's no shame in asking a question. I'll do my best to answer it. So hopefully this has enlightened you a little bit more. Once again, big thank you to my patrons. This series has gotten me a couple of new ones, which is really nice. This is what I do. This is what your Patreon support goes towards. Educational content, getting that information out there when it hasn't been previously. And as always, big thanks to Kevin, who is also a patron now. But yeah, Kevin organized this whole thing and started the madness. So until the next video, where we are going to do the burn-in, which I'm actually about to go and do now because 24 hours has passed for me since the last clip. We're going to go do the burn-in. I'll film it, and then the next video I'll be showing that and a bit of charcoal processing as well, because the concepts of that are pretty simple. So thanks for following along. Hope this answers some of your questions, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.